Hi, I'm Spencer Brown. This is my Module 8, the case study for 853. The title of this study was called Get This Kid Out of My Room. And the whole idea of it was you had a veteran teacher upset with a special education teacher because she felt like there was a student who was a danger to her and to his classmates. And so her desire was to see the special education teacher simply pull that student and work in a workbook or some kind of alternative core um, in like a suspension room or somewhere else without worrying about having a conversation with parents or modifying the IEP. So category one was just kind of an overview of what we know about the issue. And we know that Susan is a first year special education teacher and she's replacing a long time well-established one, which makes a big difference because sometimes that makes it difficult to feel like you have large shoes to fill as a first year teacher. Mrs. Davis also, they mentioned, is about a 10-year veteran and is highly respected as well. Carl's recently moved from what used to be kind of self-abuse to now being physically aggressive towards Mrs. Davis, which has caused Mrs. Davis to fear for her own safety as well as those of her students. And as I mentioned before, wants Carl immediately removed from the room. So what I need to know in order to help administer a solution here is what strategies have actually been attempted. They mentioned that we've been using a consequence and reward system. What exact punitive consequences were being attempted? Obviously, they've not been successful. What rewards have been used? Because are they truly meaningful to Carl? Does he have in-class support with him? So there was a comment about him throwing a sharp pencil at the teacher. Is there a para or someone who would be close by that could kind of monitor this aggression and keep it from escalating to a point where someone would get hurt? And then has any kind of functional behavior assessment been completed to determine, they mentioned that they sat in to try to find triggers, but have we actually done any kind of formal assessment to determine what's triggering Carl? So the problem at hand is that we should always consider removing the student completely from the core last. We always want to have a least restrictive environment for all parties, and we just want to make sure that we're trying everything we can to keep that student in general education setting. Mrs. Taylor wants more freedom than really even legally, but certainly ethically allowable. And Susan feels that pressure of, if it's the way it's always been done, what should I do with that? But the other issue at hand, obviously, is Carl needs more effective support because what is being used is not working. So the first problem, because really I kind of identify a few problems there, and so I kind of have a few separate plans. And the first problem I have, and this is really in no hierarchy of what needs to be handled first, but just kind of what I chose to talk about first. And the first is Carl. Obviously, there's issues going on there, and we're not giving him the support that he needs. And so I realized that Susan followed the commands of the district leadership, which was great. But I think ideally more strategies would have been utilized to attempt to keep Carl in the core. And I have a quote there from the Special Education Process Handbook, just kind of quoting the Kansas law that removing a child from general education classroom should not occur unless the severity of the disability is such that education in general education classes cannot be achieved satisfactorily. And I don't know that at this point we've warranted that conclusion. So I would like to know, first of all, what other strategies we could try with Carl. Leadership, in this case, really needs to set a tone for inclusion, because if we really want to make the best learning experience for Carl, it's not a matter of just setting him in the general education setting, but how do we truly provide the professional development needed and set the tone instructionally for the district that we do anticipate inclusion, and we do believe that's what's best for students. And then obviously additional support, because Carl's had some life events change, and so it seems clear as to why we would see an escalation in his in some of his behaviors, given the life events of his parents separating and a contentious separation. So the other problem is not just Carl, but the potential victims around him. While inclusion is obviously ideal, that doesn't come at the that doesn't mean that we just don't worry about victims and we just promote an unhealthy environment. And so we need to make sure that as Carl is in that general education setting, and we are, as a leader, I am inspiring the idea of inclusion, that I'm also ensuring a safe and predictable environment for the other students and for Mrs. Taylor. And so Mrs. Taylor certainly needs to understand that her fears are not taken lightly, and that that actions will be done to make sure that she and her other students are safe. So I like the idea of that safe space. That's probably a good idea for Carl. But then also, is there any kind of para or adult support on hand that can be close by, just to make sure that if they see the aggression about to take place, they can step in and keep the classroom a safe environment. The third problem, obviously, is Susan's authority. At the end, Mrs. Taylor certainly is frustrated, but I don't necessarily take that to mean that Mrs. Taylor is questioning Susan's authority or anything like that. I think she's just frustrated with the situation. It seemed like an uncomfortable one, and she's kind of just speaking out of frustration. And so really, I would just encourage Susan to continue on in a professional manner, like she is. And then not only that, but in order to do that, we have to have authentic collaboration between her and Mrs. Taylor and any parties involved in educating Carl. And so I don't take the comment at the end too seriously. I would encourage Susan not to either. Mrs. Taylor was in a state of frustration because of the discomfort of the IEP meeting. And obviously this is going to be a change, and so we just want to make sure we handle it in the most professional manner. We need to establish intensified intervention with Carl, and Susan really needs to have a big hand in that. And then ensure that the reward system that is being utilized is actually meaningful to Carl. Category 3 was just kind of evaluating those plans and saying, did I really provide success? Was I really thinking of the success of all students? And I would say that I was, because first of all, I was ensuring that all students were safe, being the classmates of Carl and Carl himself being able to exit and take advantage of a safe place. I also ensured LRE for Carl, which is extremely important, and at least ensure it to the best ability that we can. And we set also the expectation, not only for students now, but for students in the future, that this is how we professionally handle inclusion and we professionally handle difficult behaviors of students, through collaboration with each other, and also least restrictive environment is the norm. And we always, as the process handbook would suggest, we always first do everything we can to keep kids in a general education setting. So during this whole thing, I was really thinking about a few things, but the first thing was this main action of there's some seriously threatening behaviors going on. Mrs. Taylor's concerns are serious and they are valid. So right away, I need to make sure that those in my district or my building have the understanding that we need to ensure the safety of all students and teachers first. And so whatever needs to be done to make sure that everyone feels safe needs to be done immediately. But the core of this whole issue is that Carl's support has been unsuccessful, and something needs to change there in order to help Carl become a successful student. And then the peripheral issue is really that Nancy's authority, or that Susan's authority was in question as a professional. That's not really the core issue, but it is something that moving forward as a leader, you kind of got to keep the pulse on and make sure that everyone's moving forward professionally. I was feeling a fear for all parties. As I mentioned, it's certainly a concern for Carl, which kind of goes back to what I was thinking. The discomfort for Susan, having your professionality questioned by a veteran teacher. But I was also hopeful that appropriate first steps were taken in the end. And so, although it still seemed a little contentious, the IEP was set up the way it should have been. Parents were attended, even though that was an uncomfortable setting. We still, Susan still acted in a professional manner, and I would want to certainly encourage her in that. I was placing value on all students, so Carl and others. I want a safe and predictable environment and best learning environment for all students. Definitely placing value on what's the best possible education for Carl, not necessarily just what's convenient for us as teachers and staff. And then really, how do we truly leverage this to create systemic practices that can be utilized moving forward and become just how we do business in our building, in our district, through collaboration and least restrictive environment expectations. Unresolved concerns is I'm still not exactly sure what the actual plan is being utilized. It seemed like Carl would be pulled out when needed, but I wasn't exactly sure on how that would be dictated. And Carl still needs some significant support. The reward consequence practice has been ineffective with him, and we need to think about ways of intensifying his support in a way that's going to help him be successful. My other concern is if collaboration isn't authentic, then this volatile community of practice can come forward, because obviously there's some concern of, well, this isn't the way it's always been done. And if we don't have truly authentic collaboration with all parties here, Mrs. Taylor, Susan, whoever else is involved in that education, then there's going to be some volatility between general education and special education staff. And I certainly would not want that going on in a building that I'm a leader in. And also, another unresolved conflict or concern is I'm not sure where leadership was in all of this. But if leadership, if we truly want an environment of inclusion, that really needs to be, leadership needs to be instructional leadership. And so whoever the leader is in all this needs to be setting that vision and making sure professional development is occurring for the district on how to best utilize inclusion, whether that be some co-teaching or para support within the room that goes beyond just manager style. So my plan, I felt like, really took academic success or leveraged academic success by enhancing the instructional capacity, because I really focused on systemically leadership driving these inclusive practices that we know are effective. Not only that, but I also focused on collaboration. So making sure that the staff in the building is truly involved in authentic collaboration for all students, not just Carl, but other students that will emerge, other students that we have concerns about in any way, that we're having those collaboration conversations to best support all kids. I also felt like Susan displayed the leadership to ensure professional handling of such complaints or concerns. So she handled this in a way that would want to be encouraged by leadership to say that is the way I would want this handled. You took the appropriate steps. You didn't get concerned with the emotions involved here. I was definitely concerned about the personal well-being, and I took that into account by enhancing instructional capacity. First, by saying, hey, do we have a safe environment for all students, which appears in that program standard, ensuring that we have a safe and predictable environment for all kids. And that was one of the first considerations, is how do we make sure that everyone is safe. We also ensured the increased support is provided to Carl around these given life events. And so there's been a change in Carl's life. We need to make sure that we as an educational system adjust accordingly. We increase the capacity of best practices for students to come as well by setting up systemic practices of collaboration in least restrictive environment. So I kind of answered this in the last two, but overall we just increased or enhanced the instructional capacity by utilizing systemic fixes rather than just focusing on peripheral issues, ensuring that leadership is providing those professional learning opportunities to move in the way of inclusion and least restrictive environment, and establish an expectation of true collaboration within the building. So thank you for watching.